Hey everyone, this is Scott from StartMedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be talking about a free caching plugin, as you can see, called Cacheify. Cacheify is a free page caching plugin. It works basically like every other page caching plugin with some additional options. It's going to give you a bit more flexibility compared to something like Cache Enabler, but we need to discuss some of the options because not every option in here is necessarily a good one. When you install the plugin, you get a very simple menu, and this is just installed by searching the Add New Plugins menu. And you have a nice little admin panel. So when you install it, you have cache method. This is how the pages are cached, and they actually outline it very well on their documentation on their main plugin page. But the general gist is, with page caching plugins, my general advice is that you should pretty much always set it to hard disk unless you're using something like a Varnish or Nginx to cache the pages. The reason for that is if you store it as APC, which is a memory server-side cache, think of it kind of like Memcached or Redis. The problem is pages tend to be fairly large. Even if it's one page, an uncompressed page could be somewhere of around I've seen pages up to a megabyte in size just in the HTML, uncompressed obviously. But storing all that in memory can be quite intensive, and you can get what's known as a cache slam if you get a sudden large influx of users to hit the memory module. And if you're on an SSD host like Cloudways, Siteground, Kinsta, Flywheel, WordPress engine, etc., it's going to be around the same performance. It's why on your PC you don't see a lot of people making RAM disks anymore, because SSDs have gotten to the point where they're pretty fast, to where the difference between running a website on a hard drive or on an SSD, that was very substantial, but running it from strictly memory is not really that much noticeable. So my general advice is to always start from hard disk. This also gains the benefit of allowing you to set the cache to a larger period. If something is stored in memory, if you were to store a page in memory for 12 hours and you have 100 pages on your website for comparison, you couldn't store that in memory for 12 hours unless your server had a lot of memory, because every time somebody goes to the page, that page is now just going to be sat there in memory. And the disadvantage is if the server is reset or it gets cleared on a routine basis, you then have to wait for that cache the page to go back into memory and to sit there. Whereas if it's stored on the hard drive, you never have to worry about that. So my general advice is just always to run it from hard disk. We're just going to go ahead and click the save button. And then once you do that, you have a nice little setup window where it wants you to add a rule to your htaccess file for this particular setup. Most caching plugins now do this completely automatically. And if you're using Nginx, where you do not have access to htaccess files, that's only on Apache, you'll have to put this in, as it mentions here, it cannot be made if the PHP is running fast CGI, and if you're on Nginx, you would have to add a config to your Nginx configuration file. But for now, we're going to set it to hard disk. Now, as it mentions here, if you have the hard drive cache enabled, it will only expire if posts are updated or you manually flush it. I don't understand why they do that. On their documentation, they do have a note that says right here, they mention that it cannot be considered due to technical reasons. If the cache doc has been emptied at certain times, then it's recommended to call a prepared PHP file by a cron job. I don't understand necessarily the reasoning in this plugin for not including that option. Almost every other caching plugin has the ability to set an expiration time. I think it's because the plugin has no integrated method to automatically preload the cache. And this is how Cache Enabler works too. So if you need something where you can store it on the hard drive, but it can be flushed and rebuilt on every 10 hours or so, like you would in WordPress, Rocket, Swift, W3, etc., this is not a perfect option for you. This is more in line with Cache Enabler. The cache generation, it says it will not generate cache for logged in users. This is typically the best thing to do. Unless your users are logging in and you have access to something like user caching that WP Rocket offers, I would never enable it. In fact, even WP Rocket, even though they have it, I've never found a good situation where it works exactly as I expected. So I typically never store a cache page for logged in users, ever. That's why you're supposed to have a database cache like Memcached or Redis to store and save the database queries in memory. You can then choose to flush the cache for modified posts. That's totally fine. Basically, you update the post and then the cache will be flushed. And then you can flush the cache for new comments. This is a site, so if selected, the entire site cache will be flushed. This I do not recommend enabling. It will still flush the individual cache for that page. So if you go to a blog post that you've written and you post a new comment, only that post will be cleared by default. If you enable this option, it flushes the entire cache. And with the flush cache on modified post, the only reasoning I have for enabling this option to clear the entire site cache is there's not a really good way otherwise to clear the cache of this plugin on a fairly consistent basis. If you have a very large website though, with a lot of posts and you have a lot of editors, I would uncheck this option too. Of course, if you're working at that scale, I probably wouldn't recommend using this plugin anyways. For cache exceptions, you can just quickly and easily insert the post IDs and the page IDs and use a comma separator. Very easy way to do it. And then if you want to exclude by user agents, you can add them here. This is great if you need to exclude a certain user agent, maybe for mobile users to bypass the cache, you could do so here. It's basically like every other plugin that offers this feature. The browser user agents you shouldn't need to do in most situations if you have a responsive website. Under the cache minify options, you have the options to minify the HTML or the HTML inline JavaScript. Again, this is pretty much just like Cache Enabler. The one thing I will add is when it comes to minifying it, if you have another minify plugin like Auto Optimize or Fast Velocity Minify or any minification plugin, you should not enable this option in conjunction with those. Just use whatever those plugins have. And then you have the cache signature, and it adds additional details to the Cacheify signature and the HTML comment. This just helps you with debugging and getting a bit of extra info from the little HTML snippet it adds in the footer. Almost all caching plugins add this as well. You just scroll down all the way to the bottom and you'll see a nice little snippet that says Cache by Cacheify, and then it gives you a nice little date. I'll log out and show you real quick. It's nothing too really special, but once it adds it, I may actually be, there it is, Cacheify, HTTP cache. It tells you when it was cached. It puts a URL to the website for some reason, and then it gives you the time and the date that it was cached at. Now, one thing to keep in mind is it should be tied to the application time. It may be tied to server time. Just make sure that you're setting the proper dates and times for your server and the WordPress application. I'm not really a big fan on these snippets. I just enable Cloudflare to minify the HTML so that way they go away. But other than that, very simple and straightforward. Cacheify is really just another good option like Cache Enabler. With all these plugins, you're basically just getting different ways of caching the HTML. If one plugin creates a static HTML cache and uses rewrites like WP Rocket, or another plugin like Cache Enabler does the exact same thing, none of them are going to be particularly faster at that process because it's the same process. They make a saved copy of your HTML and they use an Apache rewrite to retrieve that file and serve it instead of running it through PHP. It's a good option. If you're looking for another free plugin, you don't like Cache Enabler, go ahead and give this one a shot. It's basically the exact same thing, has the same easy ways of cleaning the cache. If you have any questions, you can always ask me in the comment section below. Otherwise, make sure to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.